history of the concept of a library in Islam. It's very fascinating. Look at the role that libraries played in the intellectual development of this ummah into a civilizational power. What's interesting about this topic is that when I started researching this topic, I thought it's going to be completely separate from what we were covering over the past few weeks. But history is all interlinked, and this topic is linked to what we were covering in the past few weeks. If I had to ask you who was the first person in our history to have a academic library, many of you would not guess correctly. Many historians have tried to figure out who was the first person to actually have a library of intellectual works. And many of them came to the conclusion that the first true library in Islam was the library of Khalid ibn Yazid, the son of Yazid. Right? Again, I remind you, when studying history, to read each individual as a person. Don't look at who the father is and then blame the son, or look at the son is and then blame the father. Right? Khalid, the son of Yazid, who we spoke about a few weeks ago, we spoke about Yazid. We actually did mention Khalid a few times in the story as well. Khalid ibn Yazid was very different from his father. He was not a king. He was never the Khalifa. He was a doctor and an alchemist. He was an intellectual. So a very different person from his father. Khalid ibn Yazid is even linked to the people we studied over the past few weeks, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan and Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. We mentioned last week that Umar bin Abdul Aziz was the son-in-law of Abdul Malik. He was married to Fatima bint Abdul Malik. Khalid ibn Yazid was also the son-in-law of Abdul Malik. Khalid ibn Yazid was married to Aisha bint Abdul Malik. So that made Umar bin Abdul Aziz and Khalid ibn Yazid brother-in-laws. Right? So the first person historically that we know of who had a library was from the Umayyad family. A doctor and alchemist by the name of Khalid ibn Yazid. And Khalid was interested in the civilizational works, specifically in the fields of medicine and alchemy of the Greeks. He was interested in what the Greek Empire had produced in the past. And so he hired a Greek scribe by the name of Stephanus to translate all of these works into Arabic for him. And by one, these works began to fill up his library. And many people say this was the first. This was the first person in history, in our history, in the Muslim history, to start an academic library focused on studying the books of other civilizations so we can build upon it. And this will become the standard in the Ummah. So if we can say that Khalid's father-in-law, Abdul Malik, he established the civilizational power of the Ummah as an empire, Khalid is the first one to start the intellectual power of this Ummah as a nation that studies other civilizations and takes the best from them. You see, one of the differences between the early Muslims and the Muslims of today is we have this wrong understanding of dividing knowledge into secular and Islamic. It's a very new thing. It's very new to divide knowledge into secular and Islamic. The actual division of knowledge throughout our history is into beneficial knowledge and non-beneficial knowledge. And Muslims must seek all beneficial knowledge, wherever they can find it. And that's how the early Muslims operated. They took from all of the other civilizations. They studied the works of the Greeks, they studied the works of the Romans, they studied the works of the Hindus, they studied the works of the Zoroastrians, of the Chinese. And they took from all of them and they built upon it. And that's how the Islamic civilization came about. It wasn't just something that came out of nothing. Every civilization builds upon the works of the civilizations that came before them. To such an extent that modern European civilizations are built upon the works of the Muslims. Many of their roots go back to Islamic Spain. That's where they learned many of their ideas, from Al-Andalus. And likewise, the Muslims build upon the works of those who came before them. And central to all of this was the library. Central to all of this was the library. So we mentioned in the Umayyads' time, the most famous one that we know of is that of Khalid ibn Yazid. Fast forward a century later, the Abbasids take over, And then we have the establishment of the most famous library in Muslim history, the library of Ma'mun al-Rashid, King Ma'mun al-Rashid, known as Baytul Hikmah. Right? Now, many people today, they think Baytul Hikmah as a research center, and they imagine it in the modern sense of a research center where you hire people to do research and to write. But it wasn't really like that. This is us projecting modern understandings of the world onto history. In reality, Baytul Hikmah was the personal library of the king. It was the personal library of the king. And in this library, he collected works from a variety of civilizations. The Greeks, the Romans, the Zoroastrians, all of them. And it was this mega library where you could access works from all these different civilizations, and he allowed the intellectuals of the community in Baghdad to access his library. So it functioned like a research center, in the sense that many intellectuals would gather there, they would read the books, they would study, they would talk, they would think, they would discuss with each other, and many great ideas came out of this library. So for example, the science of algebra was invented in the library of Baytul Hikmah by Al-Khwarizmi. Right? Al-Khwarizmi was one of the researchers who spent a lot of time in Ma'mun al-Rashid's library. And his area of research was trying to figure out ways to solve complex inheritance and zakah problems, right? Because as the Ummah was getting rich, getting wealthier and wealthier, it was getting harder to distribute inheritance and work out the shares with basic mathematics. So he needed to invent advanced mathematics. So he invented algebra in the halls of this library. The libraries of Islam were not just limited to that of the palaces. As the Ummah grew, the library became central to the development of any land. And the Awqaf system played a very important role in this. Because what the Muslims did throughout our history is whenever they wanted a library, they would establish a waqf. And that library would run on the Awqaf, so that it would be self-funded and it could be free access to the public and it could go on for centuries. And they would establish libraries like this all over the Muslim world. The history books say there were multiple types of libraries in our history. There was, of course, the Sultan's library, right? Like we mentioned with Ma'mun al-Rashid. He wasn't the only one. The Fatimids in Egypt had their own library that was accessed by the intellectuals of their community, as did the king of Spain, right? They were the king's libraries. Then there were the public libraries. They were built for people to access and to study at and to learn at. Also, every masjid would have its own library. So when we think of a masjid today, we think just of a place where you pray salah, right? But historically, the masjid was not like that. Historically, the masjid was in the center of the city. So it was like you had the masjid in the center, next to it the ruler's palace, surrounding it the marketplace, surrounding it the houses. So it was central to the entire community. And the masjid had several functions. It was a place of prayer, but it also had a school, it also had a university, it also had the judges' offices, it also had the mufti's offices, it also had a library, it also had a soup kitchen, it also had the traveler's lounge. It was the center of the community. You wanted something, you go to the masjid. All of these services were in one mega complex, and you can still see this today when you go to the Muslim world. Visit the masjids that are in Istanbul that were built in the time of the Ottomans, and you'll notice there are these massive courtyards where there's multiple levels of offices and gardens and all kinds of things. It's not just a place for prayer, right? They were established to be community centers, and in this will always be a library. Then there were the personal libraries. Muslims historically loved to read, and they loved to collect books, and they loved to build upon what they read and to write their own books. And so many of the great scholars and intellectuals throughout our history had massive libraries with tens of thousands of books that would be the envy of other people. Just to give you some statistics of what libraries were like under Islam, the Fatimid library in Cairo had over 18,000 manuscripts from past civilizations. So when the Muslims conquered Egypt, they gained access to all the civilizational works of the many past empires that ruled Egypt before them. Remember, Egypt had always been the birthland of civilization, going back thousands of years. So they preserved all of this in their library, 18,000 manuscripts. The Umayyad library in Andalus. So Al-Andalus was Islamic Spain. It was the birthplace of civilization in Europe. And almost 1,000 years ago in Spain, when the rest of Europe was still in the Dark Ages, they didn't have libraries, they didn't have universities. The main library of Andalus, which was founded by King Al-Hakam II, had over 400,000 volumes of books. 400,000 volumes of books. And it's narrated there will be 170 women working in this library as scribes. So a scribe, basically back then there were no printing press, right? You couldn't print books, you couldn't copy books. If you want a copy, somebody had to write it for you by hand. That was a scribe. So this library had 170 women employed as scribes because there's always people needing copies of books. So their job is to make the copies by literally writing it by hand. In Timbuktu, in Mali, there was a library with over 700,000 manuscripts. 700,000. And at the height of Islamic power in Spain, there were 80 libraries in one city, Córdoba. One city, Córdoba, had over 80 libraries at a time when the whole of France had maybe 2 or 3 libraries. Right? This was the level of intellectual development that the Muslims reached. And these libraries didn't just function in the place where you borrow a book and read it. These were the birthplaces of ideas. These are where intellectuals met. This is where people sat and they thought and they developed great ideas. This is where many great sciences of the world were invented. From the great architects of the Muslim world, to the engineers, to the doctors, to the alchemists, to the scientists, they all had a very close relationship with their libraries. It was very important to the rise of the Muslim civilization. But likewise, just like the rise of libraries was linked to the rise of Islam, the fall of Islam, of Muslim civilizational power, was also linked to the fall of Muslim libraries. It seemed that the enemies of Islam, many of them knew that this was what made Muslims so intelligent and so powerful. So whenever Muslim lands were taken over, libraries were destroyed. And there are many examples of this: the Crusades, colonization, the conquest of Spain. But the most barbaric example and the most tragic example was the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols. Baghdad was the intellectual powerhouse of the world, with the biggest libraries in the world, with the greatest intellectual giants of the world. This is where Beit al-Hikmah was. When the Mongols invaded, the Mongols did not value knowledge. They did not value books. They actually thought of books as a type of magic. How are you reading other people's thoughts? There's some kind of magic, right? So when they invaded Baghdad, they destroyed all of the libraries of Baghdad. And they threw all of the books into the rivers until the rivers flowed black. And many of the great works of our history have been lost forever. And so just like the rise of Islam to power is linked directly to Muslims establishing libraries and studying the civilizational knowledge of other civilizations and building upon it, the fall of Islam is also linked to empires whose libraries were destroyed. It was one of many factors that contributed to the downfall of these empires. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Alhamdulillahi wahda wassalatu wassalamu ala man la nabiyya ba'da amma ba'd. Fa inna asdaqal hadithi kitabullah wa khayru hadi Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa sharrul umuri muhdathatuha wa kullu muhdathatin bid'ah wa kullu bid'atin dalalah wa kullu dalalatin fin nar. We live in a time where over the past 200 years, this ummah has taken a lot of hits. It's taken a lot of defeats. And we are now at a point where we are seeing the revival of Islam across the world. We can play a role in the intellectual revival of Islam by bringing back a culture of reading, by bringing back a culture of studying, by bringing back a culture of pushing ourselves to our full potential. You see, a lot of our youth have settled into becoming mediocre. They don't aim very high. They don't want to read. They don't want to study. They just sit in front of TikTok and Instagram, just scrolling through mindless nonsense, filling their brain with mindless nonsense, instead of actually developing it, and instead of actually filling it with beneficial knowledge. We need to revive the culture of seeking beneficial knowledge wherever we can find it. And we have to now build upon the works of the civilizations of today. We have to take the beneficial knowledge from those civilizations and separate it from the non-beneficial knowledge. And this will take time and this will take effort because it's all mixed together today. Right? The modern education system does not have a concept of beneficial knowledge and non-beneficial knowledge. They just have a concept of knowledge to such an extent that you can get a PhD writing about absolutely nothing important. The most abstract of ideas that don't benefit anyone. But in Islam, knowledge must be beneficial. And all beneficial knowledge is our knowledge. Whether it's the knowledge of medicine, whether it's the knowledge of architecture, whether it's the knowledge of Quran and Sunnah, we must seek beneficial knowledge. So some of the things that we can do as a community to revive this culture of intellectualism that was our defining trait for hundreds of years. Number one, our homes must become homes of knowledge. Every Muslim home should have a library. You should have bookshelves in your home full of books that anyone in your family can read. And you should be reading them. You should set the example for the younger generation. And you should be encouraging your family to read. And you should be encouraging your children to read. And there should be a discussion in the home. What are you reading? What did you learn? What did you benefit? Our home should become places of intellectual discussion once again. Establishing community libraries are also important, as are bookstores, as are becoming authors. I remember about 10 years ago, I made the decision to focus on writing books. And at that time, many of my friends were focusing only on making YouTube videos, right? Because they say we're moving in the direction of videos, we don't really focus on books anymore. And I said this is a mistake, because this ummah's legacy is books. You cannot get the same amount of knowledge and transformation out of a video as you can from a book. Alhamdulillah, over the past 10 years, many of them changed their minds and they all are authors now as well. And there are many, many great books coming out over the past 5 years and many more to come soon, inshallah, as more and more people are realizing the importance of writing. It's important to write. It's important to read. It's important to think. The modern world doesn't give us space to think. 24/7, the average young person has his face in his phone or his computer. He's just consuming at all moments of the day and night, consuming nonsense, really, through Instagram, through TikTok, through YouTube Shorts. They're just consuming nonsense, not giving themselves space to think, not giving themselves space to develop their own ideas, their own thoughts. We need space to think. It's important that we disconnect from technology from time to time. It's important that we take time to just sit back and think and grow and mature our thoughts. It's important that we develop new ideas that can help this ummah once again reach high levels as it did in the past. The ummah today has a lot of potential. Our biggest obstacle to our potential is our own selves. When we choose to be mediocre, when we choose not to read, when we choose not to study, when we choose to just give up on ourselves, when we choose to waste our time with things that are not beneficial, then we are hindering our own potential and our own value. And let us not forget that on the day of judgment, we will be answerable to Allah for our lives and how we spent it, for our knowledge and what we did with it, for our youth and how we spent it. Ask yourself, do I have good answers for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on how I spent all of that? So let us as a community work towards reviving this culture of deep intellectual thought. Let us work together to reviving the culture of reading, to reviving the culture of writing, to reviving the culture of being the leaders of civilization instead of the consumers of other civilizations' products. We ask Allah to allow us to contribute to the ummah. We ask Allah to allow us to become people of knowledge and people of benefit in this ummah. And we ask Allah to revive Islam and to make it powerful again. اللهم انصر المجاهدين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر المستضعفين في فلسطين، اللهم انصر المجاهدين في كل مكان، ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار، سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين.